For those who come here seeking God, may God go with you. For those who come embracing life, may life return your affections. And for those who come to seek a path, may a way be found, and the courage to take it step by step.
What you know about the civil rights movement of the 60s strongly depends on how you experienced it or how you learned about it after the fact. And there's a tremendous amount of variability in either scenario. Perhaps some of you remember when, on the evening of Sunday, March 7th, 1965, ABC interrupted the broadcast of the movie Judgment at Nuremberg to cut to footage of the vicious attack by Alabama state troopers and local vigilantes on 600 black citizens of Selma. For others, that might seem like ancient history. The civil rights movement happened before I was born, so I learned about it in school. Sort of. As much as was taught in Dallas public schools. I remember a list of Supreme Court decisions and the Civil Rights Acts, but there was little mention of the struggle to achieve those things. That part was edited out. I knew that Martin Luther King had been assassinated, but I really only knew that as a historical event. There was a long time in my life when I never cried. Not at funerals, never. Well, I died if an animal. I cried if an animal died, but people, not so much. I experienced a trauma when I was very young, and I built a wall to protect myself. If I didn't care, it wouldn't hurt. That changed with motherhood. Maybe it was the hormones. Maybe I finally had to deal with the trauma. In any case, the protective wall fell away, and I cry easily now. Usually, anyway. And sometimes embarrassingly. Until 11 years ago, everything I knew about the struggle part of the civil rights movement came to me annually on radio and TV shows on Martin Luther King Day. You gotta love NPR. Then, in 2004, I finally heard a deep enough account of the civil rights struggle that I finally understood, and I cried. The movie Selma helped me understand the horror of the civil rights struggle at still a deeper level. I saw the movie a little over a month before I went to Selma. It was my preparation, and I cried. And then I was there. I stood in front of the Brown Chapel where Dr. King held his mass meetings and spoke from the pulpit. I was there, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the very spot where blood was shed. I didn't cry. I expected to cry. I wanted to cry. I had tissues. Any caring person would have cried at the accounts the civil rights veterans told of their frustrations, of the anger, of the fear of the time. I didn't cry. That protective wall had returned, and I experienced the conference in Birmingham and the march in Selma as a detached student of history. I kept the experience in my head. I took pictures, I tweeted, I posted to Facebook, but I didn't feel. When I came home, I made a distinct effort to tell people about my trip. Then, finally, in that telling, I started to feel. The walls started to crumble. The conference drew parallels between what happened then and what is happening now, and I got that. I even applauded that while I was at the conference. But it was very analytical how I took that in. But after I got home, my worldview had shifted. I couldn't see current events in the same way. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Gardner, Walter Scott. Now they all have the backdrop of Selma and state-sanctioned brutality. The current news hits my heart with more urgency. What is going on in this country? Do we learn nothing from our own history? It makes me want to cry.
It hit me like a ton of bricks. The conference in Birmingham had yet to begin. We had just checked in and gotten our name badges, and I was wandering the halls of the hotel. I turned a corner, and there, standing in the hallway, was a small clutch of young black men. They were standing and talking to each other, and there were 4 or 5 of them. And it was clear that they already knew each other well because they were bantering and having a good time with each other. They were probably in their early to mid-20s, and they were at ease and comfortable. They were wearing name badges just like mine, so I knew they were part of the conference. And so as I passed them by, I smiled at them. And then it hit me. How, I wondered, would I have reacted seeing this same group of young black men not in a brightly lit hallway in a hotel, but on the street? How about on the street at night? Not wearing conference badges, but baggy jeans and hoodies. I didn't wonder long, because I knew the answer. I knew that if I'd seen this same group of young black men hanging out on the street, whether it was in Birmingham or Philadelphia or Media, everybody's hometown, right? I'd have been anxious, maybe even fearful, at least wary and on guard. I know from past experience that my heart would have started beating a little faster and my blood pressure would have gone up. And I know that I would have at all costs avoided making any kind of eye contact. No way would I have smiled at them. All of this went through my mind in a split second. And as I said, the conference hadn't even started yet. This is in part why I went to Selma and to the Marching in the Ark of Justice pilgrimage, to confront and encounter my past. It's a past that's complicated by racism and regret. The regret piece has always lingered at the back of my mind. I regret that I was born in 1956. And I know it's silly to regret something that you have no control over, but there it is. Having been born when I was, I never had the chance to join the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I was only 6 years old. I never had the chance to be a freedom rider, one of those courageous college students who boarded buses headed for the Deep South, knowing that they rode those buses with big targets on their backs. I never had the chance to respond to Dr. King's call to come to Selma after the ambush, and it was an ambush, of nonviolent marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on what became known as Bloody Sunday. I was too young for all these things, even too young to remember them firsthand. What I wonder now is what I would have done had I not been too young. If I had been old enough, would I have gone to Washington or Mississippi or Selma? I'll never know. So, in part, I went to Selma for the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday because I could. I didn't want one more regret. I also went to exorcise some old demons. Because you see, I was raised a racist. And truth be told, I still struggle with my racism. That's what that story I opened with is all about when I encountered those young black men in the conference center. I was brought up in an environment that taught me that black people, especially young black men, are violent and scary people. That they're criminals and thugs and drug dealers. That you need to give them a wide berth, and that you'd better hold on to your wallet if you see a black man approaching you on the street at night. Because, of course, they're all muggers and murderers. This is what I was taught to believe. And although I know now that that was all lies, I can't keep my body from having that visceral biological reaction in those same situations. I can't keep my heart from skipping a beat when I'm alone on a subway and a group of African American teens boards the car. I can't help it if my blood pressure starts to pound in my ears when I'm on the street at night and a couple of black kids are approaching me on the sidewalk. But what I can do is I can learn from the past and apply those learnings to the future. What I can do, what we all can do, is to do the work of naming racism when we see it and working to put an end to it in the places where we live. So that's why I went to Selma, too. To learn about the struggle that was and the struggle that is. Selma was half a century ago. Selma is now. Black lives matter.
There's a note on my phone from 9:47 a.m., June 29th, 2014. It reads, March 2015, Selma. That's when I decided that I was going. I was at General Assembly, the annual conference of the UUA, and there was a postcard advertising the event in my chair. What was it about this postcard that so boldly told me to go? Not, that might be interesting. I wonder if I could go. I knew I was going right then. Why? Who am I in relationship that drew me so strongly to go? I don't know. And 9 months from June to March is a long time to wait, to hold the conviction to go. And I likely would not have gone if these guys hadn't been going also. That would have been way too scary. So is my important relationship with these guys? Maybe. Partially. More, I think I knew immediately that I would go because I wanted to understand the past in a way that I knew I didn't. I was on a quest for knowledge and understanding. In Alabama, I heard personal accounts of the civil rights movement from the people who had been there and from the families of those who were murdered. The families of Jimmy Lee Jackson, Viola Liuzzo, Reverend James Reeve. I can identify with Viola Liuzzo, though 3 months ago I didn't know who she was. In 1965, Viola Liuzzo was a 39-year-old UU and mother who saw what was going on in Alabama, got mad, and went to do what she could to help. I can see myself doing that. In Birmingham last month, Viola Liuzzo's daughter, Penny, said, "It feels like we're going backward." That's a powerful statement from someone who lost her mother to the movement 50 years ago. And sobering. A few years ago, when I was involved in the Occupy movement, my daughter would tell me before I left home to go into Philly, "Don't get arrested, Mommy." Not that my being arrested was ever a realistic possibility, but still, she didn't know that in my back pocket I had a slip of paper wrapped around my ID that said, "In case of emergency, call." On the bus ride from Birmingham to Selma, we passed the place on Highway 80 where Viola Liuzzo was chased down and shot by members of the Ku Klux Klan. There's a memorial to her there on the side of the road. As our bus slowed and then passed, the Liuzzo family was gathered for a private memorial service. They stood inside the fence that protects the memorial from vandals. It's a nice fence. We have a problem in this nation, and when I see a problem, I want to fix it. The first step is to stop ignoring it. Goosebumps and tears. Reflecting on my trip to Alabama, it comes down to goosebumps and tears. There is no way that we can convey, or I can convey, all the intense emotions that surrounded our journey, my retirement gift to myself. But here's a few thoughts. We drove through Selma, and you'll see later the water tower that says, "Selma, a nice place to live." We visited the Reeve Memorial and the Walker Cafe, where the UU ministers dined before the fatal beating. Thursday night, the overflow crowd at the memorial service and meeting at the Tabernacle Church heard Dr. Bernice King, the Reverend Dr. William Barber, and the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright, who said, "Black lives matter. All lives matter. That's all that matters." We had a yummy soul food dinner at the George Wallace Community College in Selma. Yes, that George Wallace. The Good Samaritan Hospital, where James Reeve was initially treated, lies abandoned. The historic Brown Chapel had beautiful stained glass windows with Jewish symbols on one side and Christian symbols on the other, and ones of the Holy Spirit in the back. However, it was the "no handguns" decal on the front entrances that made me very angry. The complex family dynamics of a 1960s Selma family was brilliantly portrayed in a dramatic reading of Night Blooms. And I think we're all going to try to get the play up in Philadelphia. One of the founders of Black Lives Matter articulated the struggle from a 20-something black woman's perspective. Opal Tometi said she had a hard time writing her Saturday morning statement because of the murder of the young man in Minnesota the night before. That's how things collided in Alabama. The Reverend Dr. Barber, who's the North Carolina NAACP president, described the criteria for forward together in the components of morally just and constitutionally defensible. The Reverend Bob Hardees, who is the senior minister at All Souls in Washington, preaches weekly from the pulpit where Reverend James Reeve preached 50 years ago. And he described the James Reeve Voting Rights Project that's been started. One component is that 150 to 200 members of All Souls Church worked with the North Carolina UU congregations to get people registered in North Carolina. And they called over 10,000 voters in North Carolina. Reverend Jay Leach, the minister of the UU Church in Charlotte, said that Reverend William Barber, expended huge amounts of political capital within the African American religious community to work for the passage of marriage equality. Reverend Barber said, "I'm tired of people hating on one another." The heartbreak and the fear in the white grandfather's voice as he shared his fears for his biracial grandson's safety brought me to tears. 9 busloads of UUs spent the morning in St. Jude City on Sunday near Montgomery, where 50 years ago, 25,000 people joined the 300 marchers that had been granted permission to go from Selma to Montgomery for those last 20 miles. I, too, saw the family of Viola Liuzzo and wept. Finally, arriving in Selma to waving and welcoming residents who were on their front porches, just waving at us all. And to be with UUs, hundreds of UUs, in yellow T-shirts and yellow stoles. And it seemed more like a celebration than a mourning or a memorial. However, nothing prepared me for turning the corner onto Broad Street. A sea of humanity spread out before us and the infamous Pettus Bridge, which physically sent chills down my spine. It was a remembrance, a recognition of the progress that has been made since Bloody Sunday, and a commitment to fight every effort to turn back the clock, and an urgent call to renew our dedication and commitment to justice and equality in our country, all distilled in a single moment. Truly a personal pilgrimage. I encourage each one of you to explore the Living Legacy Project videos. There's a link in the order of service, and all the resources available from the UUA. To read Reverend Barber's Forward Together. Really go whole hog and take a Living Legacy pilgrimage tour. And for God's sake, let us work for voter rights in Pennsylvania. Systemic changes are needed in our state and nation, and each of us has a role to play. After all my tears and goosebumps, the fierce urgency of now calls me and you to action.
I went to Selma because I wanted to be part of this historical celebration, to go back to a time that I remembered vividly from childhood. With my love of history, getting an opportunity to act out an event was an exciting and intriguing prospect. I am still continuing to process what actually happened to me during the 4 days we spent in Birmingham and Selma. The experience of walking the same path of those brave souls 50 years ago was so much richer and deeper than what I expected. I felt the past and present colliding. Growing up in a family where current events were routinely discussed each night at the dinner table, my thoughts about race relations in the U.S. began to form at a very early age. From my dad, the messages were loud and clear. You don't fight world wars to protect our freedoms and withhold that freedom from some because of their race. And secondly, every child deserves a good education. If you wanted a relatively peaceful dining experience, you never mentioned George Wallace with my dad in the room. Another pivotal event that happened during these formative years occurred during church one Sunday. As we were engaged in a service, a rather large black man entered our church, which in a rather homogeneously white Hunterdon County, New Jersey, was highly unusual. While all the other congregants diverted their eyes from the newcomer, my mother got right up and asked the man his name introduced herself, and asked if there was something she could do to help him with, or something she could help him with. Later, my sister and I remember Mom telling us that we should always live by the song we learned in Sunday school, that Jesus loved all the children of the world. I thank my parents for those important early lessons. I must admit, with the deaths of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy during my high school years, and a whole lot less time at the kitchen table debating politics, that race seemed to have been resolved in America, and I was on to all things anti-Vietnam War. I remember rather naively thinking that with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the work of race relations was now done. Of course, you must remember that there were really no races in either my elementary or high school, so my only frame of reference was TV. It was only later, living outside my place of birth, that I realized going to college in the South, there were 5 black women at Mary Washington College my freshman year, all of them assigned to Northerners as roommates. And then moving to Washington, D.C., after that I began to witness prejudice and unequal access to opportunities. And then we moved to Maine. My time in Birmingham at the conference and visiting Selma helped refocus my attention to race and race relations and gave me a clear vision of the work that still needs to be done. Standing with a crowd of people waiting to cross the bridge on the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, I was waiting for about 40 minutes to get onto the bridge behind a black man holding his 20-month-old son, who engaged in eye contact, and we played some great games of peekaboo. I thought of my grandson, James, who was the same age, and I realized how this child in front of me was going to have to work 20 times as hard for everything in life because of the color of his skin. And in that moment, the past and present collided. This thought made me cry, and as I think back and see this little boy's face, my heart breaks. While there were no police and troopers waiting on the other side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, there is still so much justice work to be done to ensure that we are all on equal footing. The work I do in the future will be for that little boy in his father's arms and for all the children. When we ask, and how are the children in this country, I hope that in the near future that we can say they are all, each and every one of them, doing well.
We all know the names Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers. We may even know the names Jimmy Lee Jackson and James Reeve and Viola Liuzzo. As you've heard, these last two are important for us as Unitarian Universalists to know. Jim Reeve was a Unitarian Universalist minister who was murdered in Selma, and Viola Liuzzo was a Unitarian Universalist who was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan as she was driving one of the marchers, one of the people who had marched from Selma to Montgomery. She was giving him a ride home back to Selma when the KKK ran her down and shot her in the head. And so while you might know these names, I'm guessing that you've never heard the name Hollis Watkins. Anybody? I'd never heard of Hollis Watkins, not until he told us his story. And believe me, it was some story. Hollis Watkins was the youngest of 12 children in his family. His father was a sharecropper in Mississippi in the middle of the last century. So Hollis was just a couple generations removed from the enslavement of his family members. In 1961, as a 19-year-old kid, Hollis became the first Mississippi student to join the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And he started working on voting rights. In Mississippi, in 1961, he was 19. I don't know what you all were doing when you were 19 years old, but when I was 19 years old, I was nowhere near that. Mr. Watkins told us what it was like to be working for voting rights in Mississippi in the early 60s. He told us the story of being chased by the Ku Klux Klan, and he was saved by the sudden appearance of a dirt road that led into a cornfield where he could hide. He told us about the time he was in jail and the jailer came in and told him he was free to go. Unexpectedly, the jailer said, "You can go now." He opened the cell door. But Hollis knew it was a trick. He knew that if he walked out that door, outside, that there was a crowd waiting to shoot him in the back because he was escaping from the jail. He told us about another time sitting in a police station and having a policeman wave a hangman's noose in front of his face. He told us about another time he was in jail, and they sent in a white woman into the cell block. And the white woman was claiming that she'd been beaten by the police, and she wanted to show Hollis her bruises. But he knew that, too, was a trick, because if he had looked at the white woman, he would have been subject to being killed. And so instead, he faced the cell block wall. He outsmarted them all at every turn. And he told us how God had told him he would never be killed doing civil rights work, and how his deep, deep faith kept him going through all of these threats to his life. And I sat there as I listened to him, and I wondered what had happened in his life that led him to dedicate his life to the fight for civil rights. I speculated. I thought, well, maybe when he was young, he saw a white man spit at his sister, or maybe even he had had a brother who had been lynched. So I asked him during the question and answer period. I asked him, and he told me that he always remembered the time when he was working in the field with his daddy. He was maybe 8 or 9 years old. And his daddy told him that when you see a wrong, you've got to do what you can to right it. That was it. Nothing more dramatic or traumatic than that. It sounds to me like a scene right out of The Grapes of Wrath or something like that, but it was this simple statement that created the Hollis Watkins who stood before us more than half a century later. How many of us have received that same message from our own mothers or fathers or perhaps teachers when we were growing up? When you see a wrong, do what you can to right it. And how many of us took it to heart like Hollis Watkins did? Another thing about Hollis Watkins was that after everyone left Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and South Carolina, after the Unitarian Universalist ministers and church members went back home, after the Freedom Riders stopped riding the buses, after the bus boycott and the march to Montgomery ended, after all the news cameras and all the reporters had left the South, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, after victory was declared and everyone else went home, Hollis Watkins kept working. He didn't fold up his tent and put his signs away. No, he kept on fighting the fight. So he looked around to see what still needed to be done, and so he did it. And what did he do? He started a school that would train new leaders, that would train African American young people to be leaders in their own communities. This school is called Southern Echo, and it still exists today. And it's helping to mold young people into effective civic leaders who can serve on local school boards, town councils, and other parts of the government. And now, this is the thing. It took him 20 years. 20 years. Think about that. 2 decades to get Southern Echo started. To get it from an idea, from a seed of an idea, to become a reality. Hollis Watkins has spent his entire adult life working to right the wrongs of bigotry and racism and hatred. Forget Superman and Batman and Neil Armstrong and John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I have a new hero. His name is Hollis Watkins, and I want you to remember his name and his face. After he was done speaking to us, I just had to go up to him and shake his hand. And truth be told, I was hoping that maybe just a little bit of his courage and his commitment would kind of rub off on me. We remember the Kings and the Kennedys. We remember the Reeves and the Jacksons. We remember the names of the leaders, and we remember the names of the martyrs. As well we should. And we never know the names of the Hollis Watkinses or the countless other foot soldiers who simply showed up because they knew they had to. We like to remind ourselves of that quote that originally came from Unitarian minister Theodore Parker and has since been adopted and co-opted from people like Martin Luther King all the way to President Obama. We know how it goes. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. This statement gives us hope. It motivates us to keep going on. And I've always thought that each of us has the power to bend that arc just a little bit. If we all put our weight on it, maybe, just maybe, we'll see some real progress in our own lifetimes. The lasting lesson of my trip to Selma, a Selma that today is one of the poorest communities in our nation, with unemployment at twice the rate of the rest of Alabama, and Alabama is pretty close to the bottom. What has stayed with me since I crossed that bridge and stood where blood was spilled is that we will likely never see the impact of the work that we do. We won't see that arc bend. And more importantly, that can't stop us. You see, I'm a results-oriented person. I'm sure that's a shock to those of you who know me. I know that the outcomes of this work are never going to be experienced by us. Yes, we want cops to stop murdering young black men in the street. Yes, we want to live in a society where black lives do, in fact, matter. We want to see a day when all people are judged solely by the content of their character. But we won't. We won't. That is the cold, hard, simple truth. But what Hollis Watkins has taught me is that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that we won't reap the fruits of our labors. It doesn't matter that a newer Jim Crow will probably replace the new Jim Crow if we were to eliminate it. It doesn't matter that we have new names to know, new martyrs to rally around, it seems, almost every day. The march we march will not be the next Selma. The thing we do won't be the great hinge on which history pivots. Our names will never be known, and we won't ever see the difference that we make. And that's not the point. That doesn't matter. What matters is that we do what we can. That we make the choice not to throw up our hands because it all seems so futile, but to put our shoulder to the wheel and perhaps move it just an inch forward. It's our job to build the bridges, even though we won't get across that divide and into the promised land in our lifetime. Hollis Watkins has lived his life knowing that. And look at the life he led. We can do it too.
My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
Was given to me, and every page spelled liberty. Oh, my trials will soon be over. There is a tree in paradise, and the pilgrims call it the tree of life. Oh, my trials will soon be over, but it's too late, my friend, too late. But never mind. Oh, my trials will soon be over. If religion were a thing that money could buy, then the rich would live and the poor would die. Soon